Don't skip. Your soulmate secretly tested your honesty, and what they discovered changed everything they thought they knew. Listen carefully, because this message is for you, and your heart needs this right now. For a very long time, your soulmate carried invisible scars from experiences they rarely talked about. Life had taught them that words could be beautiful while intentions remained hidden. They had trusted people before, only to discover that promises were empty. They had believed stories that later turned out to be lies. They had opened their heart to people who eventually revealed different versions of themselves. Because of those experiences, they developed a habit they rarely admitted to anyone. Instead of trusting immediately, they observed. Instead of believing words alone, they paid attention to actions. Instead of asking direct questions, they watched how people behaved when they thought nobody was paying attention. And listen to this. When you entered their life, they didn't plan to test you. They didn't sit down and create some complicated plan. It happened naturally. Their past experiences made them cautious, and caution caused them to pay attention to details most people overlook. At first, they simply observed the little things. The way you spoke to people who couldn't do anything for you. The way you handled mistakes. The way you reacted when situations became inconvenient. The way you treated others during moments when kindness required effort. Your soulmate expected to find contradictions eventually. They expected to find the gap between words and actions because that was what they had become used to seeing in other people. But your heart needs this right now because something unexpected happened. The contradictions never appeared. Every time they looked for evidence that your honesty wasn't real, they found evidence supporting it instead. Every time they expected inconsistency, they found consistency. Every time they prepared themselves for disappointment, they found another reason to respect you. At first, they dismissed it as coincidence. They told themselves they needed more time. They convinced themselves that nobody could be that genuine all the time. But weeks passed. Then more weeks. Then more experiences. And every new observation seemed to reinforce the same conclusion. You remained the same person regardless of who was around. You remained the same person whether circumstances benefited you or challenged you. You remained the same person when honesty was easy and when honesty was difficult. And listen to this, that consistency began affecting them more deeply than they realized. Without noticing it, they started lowering some of the emotional walls they had built around themselves. Not completely. Not all at once. But little by little. Every honest action from you removed another brick from a wall that had taken years to build. Every genuine interaction weakened another fear they had carried for far too long. Still, a part of them remained cautious. A part of them wondered whether they were missing something. A part of them expected reality to eventually prove them wrong. So they continued watching. They continued paying attention. They continued looking for the moment when your actions would stop matching your words. Your heart needs this right now because that moment never came. In fact, something very different happened. One day, your soulmate found themselves observing a situation where honesty would have been inconvenient for you. Nobody was pressuring you to tell the truth. Nobody was watching closely. Nobody would have blamed you for choosing the easier path. In fact, choosing honesty seemed likely to create extra complications. Most people would have taken the shortcut. Most people would have protected themselves first. Most people would have looked for a way around the truth. But you didn't. You chose integrity anyway. And listen to this, that moment stayed with them. Long after the situation ended, they kept thinking about it. They replayed it in their mind. They examined every detail. Because what they had witnessed challenged everything they thought they knew about trust. It challenged every defensive belief they had built from previous disappointments. The truth was becoming impossible to ignore. You weren't being honest because it made you look good. You weren't being honest because it benefited you. You were being honest because honesty was part of your character. That realization affected them more than they expected. For years, they had quietly believed that everyone eventually revealed selfish motives. They had convinced themselves that genuine honesty was rare. They had accepted the idea that trust always came with hidden risks. Yet here you were, quietly proving those beliefs wrong without even knowing it. Your soulmate found themselves feeling emotions they hadn't felt in a very long time. Hope, respect, admiration, and perhaps most importantly, relief. Relief that genuine people still existed. Relief that not everyone wore a mask. Relief that integrity wasn't just something people talked about, it was something some people actually lived by. And listen to this. That relief became emotional because it touched wounds much deeper than you realized. Your soulmate wasn't only reacting to what they learned about you. They were reacting to everything your honesty represented. Every disappointment from the past. Every betrayal they had experienced. Every promise that had been broken. Every moment that taught them to doubt. Somehow, your actions were challenging all of those painful memories at once. They were showing them another possibility. They were showing them that trust didn't always end in regret. They were showing them that honesty could still be real. As these realizations grew stronger, your soulmate started remembering all the times they had quietly questioned you. Not out of malice, but out of fear. They remembered moments when they had doubted your intentions. They remembered situations where they expected inconsistency. They remembered all the little tests they had unconsciously created through observation. And your heart needs this right now because every one of those tests seemed to produce the same result. Again and again, your character remained steady. Again and again, your actions aligned with your values. Again and again, reality confirmed what your words had already suggested. Eventually, the evidence became overwhelming. They could no longer explain it away. They could no longer pretend they were uncertain. They could no longer hold on to the fears that had once protected them. And listen to this, that was the moment everything changed. Not because of one dramatic event, but because of the accumulation of countless small truths. Your soulmate realized that the person standing before them wasn't the person they feared finding. You weren't another lesson in disappointment. You weren't another temporary illusion. You weren't another reminder to keep their guard up. Instead, you were becoming a reminder that honesty still mattered. That authenticity still existed. That trust was still possible. The emotional impact of that realization was far greater than you might imagine. They found themselves thinking about you differently. They found themselves appreciating qualities they once overlooked. They found themselves feeling grateful for your presence in ways they struggled to explain. Because your honesty wasn't just earning their trust, it was healing something inside them. It was restoring faith they thought had disappeared. It was rebuilding hope they thought they had lost. And listen to this. One evening, after reflecting on everything they had observed, everything they had learned, and everything they had been feeling, the emotional weight finally became too much to hold inside. They sat alone with their thoughts. They thought about the tests they had never admitted to conducting. They thought about the fears that had motivated them. They thought about the countless moments when they expected to be disappointed. Then they thought about the reality they had discovered instead. A reality filled with consistency, honesty, integrity, and truth. That was when the tears began forming in their eyes. Not because they were sad. Not because anything terrible had happened. But because relief can be powerful. Relief can be overwhelming. Relief can break through emotional walls just as effectively as pain. For the first time in a very long time, they felt safe enough to believe. Safe enough to trust. Safe enough to hope. And your heart needs this right now because those tears carried years of emotions with them. They carried old fears. They carried old disappointments. They carried old wounds. As those tears fell, it felt as though part of the weight they had been carrying for so long was finally leaving. They realized that your honesty had done something extraordinary. It had reminded them that the world still contained genuine people. It had reminded them that integrity still existed. It had reminded them that trust wasn't foolish when placed in the right person. And in that deeply emotional moment, one realization became impossible to ignore. Whatever doubts they once carried about you had disappeared completely. Whatever fears had caused them to keep their distance were fading away. In their place stood something stronger than uncertainty and more powerful than suspicion, genuine trust. A trust earned not through promises, not through persuasion, but through consistent actions repeated over time. And as they wiped away their tears and reflected on everything they had learned, they found themselves holding on to a truth they never expected to discover, that your honesty had not only changed the way they saw you, but had also changed the way they saw trust itself. Listen carefully, because this is the chapter where your soulmate can no longer deny what their heart has already begun accepting, and your heart needs this right now. After everything they had quietly observed, after every small moment that seemed insignificant on the surface but meaningful underneath, your soulmate found themselves standing in unfamiliar emotional territory. For years, they had relied on caution to protect themselves. They believed that being skeptical was safer than being vulnerable. They believed that expecting disappointment prevented deeper pain. Yet the more they watched you, the harder it became to maintain those beliefs. Every test they never admitted to conducting seemed to lead to the same result. Every situation they paid attention to revealed the same pattern. Every observation reinforced the same truth. You were honest when honesty benefited you, but more importantly, you were honest when it didn't. And listen to this, that distinction mattered more than you realize. Anyone can tell the truth when there is a reward attached to it. Anyone can appear trustworthy when people are paying attention. But genuine integrity reveals itself when there is no advantage to being honest. Genuine integrity appears when the easier path would be to hide something, avoid responsibility, or tell people what they want to hear. Your soulmate began noticing those moments more frequently. They noticed how you responded when mistakes happened. They noticed how you handled misunderstandings. They noticed how you reacted when situations became uncomfortable. Instead of looking for excuses, you seemed to look for truth. Instead of protecting your image at all costs, you seemed more concerned with doing what felt right. At first, your soulmate struggled to process what they were seeing. They kept expecting the pattern to break. They kept waiting for the moment when your actions would finally contradict your words. They kept assuming that eventually they would discover something that justified their caution. But that moment never arrived. In fact, the opposite happened. The deeper they looked, the more evidence they found supporting your sincerity. And your heart needs this right now because that realization created an emotional conflict inside them. Part of them wanted to trust what they were seeing. Part of them wanted to believe that someone like you could genuinely exist. But another part of them remained afraid. That fear didn't come from you. It came from old wounds. It came from past experiences that had taught them difficult lessons. They remembered people who promised honesty but delivered deception. They remembered relationships that began with trust and ended with disappointment. They remembered times when they ignored warning signs because they wanted to believe the best in someone. Those memories made them cautious. Those memories made them hesitate. Those memories made them question whether they should fully trust what they were discovering about you. And listen to this. Despite those fears, your actions continued speaking louder than their doubts. Every time uncertainty appeared, another experience seemed to answer it. Every time they questioned your intentions, another moment revealed your character. Every time they prepared themselves for disappointment, reality surprised them instead. Gradually, their skepticism began losing its strength. The walls they had spent years building started weakening. They didn't collapse all at once. They didn't disappear overnight. But little by little, the emotional distance they once maintained became harder to justify. Your soulmate found themselves thinking about you more often than before. Not because they were trying to. Not because they were forcing anything. It happened naturally. They would remember something you said and realize it matched something you later did. They would recall a difficult situation and recognize how honestly you handled it. They would compare your behavior to others they had known and notice how rare your consistency really was. And your heart needs this right now because consistency creates trust in ways grand gestures never can. Big promises can be impressive for a moment, but repeated honesty creates something much deeper. It creates safety. It creates confidence. It creates the feeling that someone is exactly who they claim to be. That feeling was beginning to grow inside your soulmate. Yet they still weren't ready to fully surrender their doubts. There was one final barrier standing in the way. A fear that maybe they were only seeing what they wanted to see. A fear that maybe they were overlooking something important. So without consciously planning it, they continued observing. They continued paying attention to details. They continued watching how you behaved when life became complicated. Then one particular situation changed everything. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't the kind of moment most people would even remember. But your soulmate remembered it because of what it revealed. A situation arose where you had every opportunity to protect yourself by avoiding the full truth. Nobody was pressuring you. Nobody was demanding complete honesty. Taking the easier route would have been understandable. Most people would have done exactly that. But instead, you chose transparency. You chose accountability. You chose truth, even though it created inconvenience. And listen to this. Your soulmate was not prepared for the emotional impact of witnessing that decision. Something inside them shifted instantly. For a moment, all the doubts they had been carrying seemed to lose their power at the same time. The fears they had protected for years suddenly felt unnecessary. The defensive beliefs they had relied on no longer made sense. Because standing in front of them was undeniable evidence that honesty was not simply something you talked about, it was something you practiced. They replayed that moment over and over in their mind. They analyzed every detail. They looked for alternative explanations. They searched for reasons to remain skeptical. But every path led to the same conclusion. You had chosen integrity when nobody expected it. You had chosen honesty when it cost you something. You had chosen truth when it would have been easier not to. And your heart needs this right now because that realization touched something much deeper than trust. It touched hope. For years, your soulmate had quietly worried that genuine honesty was becoming rare. They had begun accepting the idea that everyone eventually compromised their values when circumstances became difficult. Yet here you were proving otherwise. You were reminding them that character still mattered. You were reminding them that integrity still existed. You were reminding them that some people remain true to themselves regardless of circumstances. The emotional weight of that realization became impossible to contain. They started thinking about all the assumptions they had carried through life. They started questioning beliefs they once considered facts. They started realizing how much of their worldview had been shaped by disappointment. Then they looked at you and saw something different. They saw proof that not every story ends the same way. They saw proof that trust does not always lead to heartbreak. They saw proof that honesty can still be real. And listen to this, that is when the emotions finally surfaced. Sitting alone with their thoughts, they reflected on everything they had observed. Every small test. Every quiet observation. Every moment of uncertainty. They realized that you had passed every standard they never admitted to having. Not because you were trying to impress anyone. Not because you knew you were being observed. But because honesty was simply part of who you were. The realization overwhelmed them. Tears began filling their eyes before they fully understood why. These weren't tears of sadness. They weren't tears of pain. They were tears of relief. Relief that their faith in people had not been completely misplaced. Relief that authenticity still existed. Relief that the world still contained people whose actions matched their words. Those tears carried years of disappointment out of their heart. They carried years of caution. They carried years of fear. And as those emotions finally surfaced, your soulmate found themselves feeling lighter than they had in a very long time. For the first time, they allowed themselves to imagine what it would feel like to fully trust someone again. For the first time, they considered the possibility that honesty could be the foundation of something meaningful rather than the exception to the rule. And your heart needs this right now because that moment changed everything. It wasn't just about what they learned regarding your honesty. It was about what your honesty taught them about life, about trust, and about themselves. They realized they no longer wanted to live entirely behind emotional walls. They no longer wanted fear making every decision. They no longer wanted old disappointments controlling new possibilities. Because thanks to what they had discovered about you, they were beginning to believe something they hadn't believed in a long time, that genuine trust is possible when it is placed in the right person, and for the first time in years, they felt ready to believe that person might be you. Listen carefully, because this is the chapter where your soulmate finally stops questioning what they have discovered and starts accepting it as the truth, and your heart needs this right now. After everything they had observed, after every quiet test they never admitted they were conducting, after every moment that revealed another piece of your character, your soulmate reached a point where denying reality became more difficult than accepting it. For so long, they had lived with one foot in trust and the other in fear. Part of them wanted to believe in your honesty, but another part kept holding on to old wounds that warned them to stay cautious. Those wounds had been with them for years. They came from broken promises, disappointing experiences, and people who said one thing while doing another. Because of that history, your soulmate had developed a habit of expecting hidden motives. Whenever someone appeared genuine, they quietly waited for the mask to fall. Whenever someone seemed trustworthy, they looked for inconsistencies. Whenever someone claimed to value honesty, they paid close attention to whether those values remained present when life became complicated. And listen to this, when they first started paying attention to you, they expected the same pattern to repeat itself. They expected to eventually discover contradictions. They expected to find moments where your actions no longer matched your words. They expected reality to expose something they couldn't yet see. But reality kept surprising them. Every observation seemed to strengthen the same conclusion. Every situation revealed another example of consistency. Every interaction made it harder to hold on to their doubts. What affected them most wasn't one dramatic event. It wasn't a grand gesture or an emotional speech. It was the ordinary moments. The moments most people overlook. The moments where character quietly reveals itself without trying. They noticed how you responded when nobody was watching. They noticed how you treated people who couldn't benefit you. They noticed how you behaved when circumstances became frustrating. They noticed that your values didn't seem to change depending on convenience. And your heart needs this right now because those observations carried enormous weight in their mind. Anyone can appear honest when there is something to gain. Anyone can act with integrity when people are paying attention. But remaining honest during difficult moments requires something deeper. It requires character. It requires conviction. It requires authenticity. The more they observed, the more they realized that your honesty wasn't a performance. It wasn't something you turned on and off depending on circumstances. It was simply part of who you were. At first, that realization felt uncomfortable. Not because there was anything wrong with it, but because it challenged beliefs they had spent years protecting. Your soulmate had built emotional defenses for a reason. Those defenses helped them avoid disappointment. Those defenses helped them avoid vulnerability. Those defenses helped them feel safe. Yet every new thing they learned about you weakened those defenses. Every honest action created another crack in the walls they had built around their heart. And listen to this, they didn't know how to respond. Part of them felt relieved. Part of them felt hopeful. But another part felt afraid because hope requires vulnerability. Hope asks people to believe in possibilities. Hope asks people to risk disappointment. For a long time, your soulmate had convinced themselves that being cautious was safer than being hopeful. Yet you were quietly proving that caution isn't always protection. Sometimes caution becomes a prison. Sometimes it prevents people from recognizing something genuine standing right in front of them. As these realizations grew stronger, your soulmate began reflecting on their own behavior. They started thinking about all the times they had questioned your intentions internally. They thought about moments when they assumed there might be more to the story. They thought about situations where they waited for evidence that never appeared. The more they reflected, the more they realized something important. You had never given them a reason to doubt your honesty. The doubts had come from their past, not from your actions. And your heart needs this right now because recognizing that truth was emotional. It forced them to confront old fears they hadn't fully healed from. It forced them to admit that some of their caution had less to do with reality and more to do with pain they carried from previous experiences. That realization wasn't easy. It required honesty with themselves. It required self-reflection. It required courage. But it also created growth. For the first time in a long time, your soulmate began separating the past from the present. They began understanding that not everyone deserved to be judged according to someone else's mistakes. They began understanding that your story wasn't the same as the stories that hurt them before. They began understanding that genuine people do exist. And listen to this, that understanding created a powerful emotional shift. Instead of looking for reasons not to trust you, they started appreciating the reasons they already did. Instead of focusing on potential disappointments, they focused on what your actions consistently revealed. Instead of preparing for failure, they started imagining possibilities. The change wasn't dramatic on the outside. Nobody else would have noticed it. But inside, it felt enormous. It felt like a door slowly opening after being closed for years. It felt like sunlight entering a room that had remained dark for too long. It felt like relief. One evening, while reflecting on everything they had learned, your soulmate found themselves overwhelmed by gratitude. Gratitude that they hadn't allowed fear to completely control their perception. Gratitude that they had paid attention to reality instead of assumptions. Gratitude that they had discovered something genuine before walking away from it. As they sat alone with those thoughts, they realized something that brought tears to their eyes all over again. Your honesty had done more than earn their trust. It had restored something inside them. It had restored faith. Faith that people can mean what they say. Faith that integrity still matters. Faith that truth can survive even in a world where deception often seems easier. And your heart needs this right now, because those tears weren't about sadness. They were about healing. They were about the release of emotional weight they had been carrying for far too long. They were about finally allowing themselves to believe that not everyone would repeat the same painful patterns. The more they thought about it, the more emotional they became. They remembered nights spent questioning people's intentions. They remembered moments when trust had been broken. They remembered how difficult it had become to believe in authenticity. Then they looked at everything they had learned about you. They looked at the consistency. They looked at the honesty. They looked at the character revealed through countless ordinary moments. The contrast was impossible to ignore. For the first time in years, they felt something they hadn't felt in a very long time: certainty. Not certainty about the future. Not certainty about how every chapter would unfold. But certainty about one thing. The honesty they saw in you was real. It wasn't temporary. It wasn't an illusion. It wasn't something they imagined. It was genuine. And listen to this: once that certainty arrived, something remarkable happened. The fear that had once guided so many of their decisions began losing its power. They stopped needing constant proof. They stopped searching for hidden motives. They stopped expecting the worst. Instead, they allowed themselves to trust what they had already seen. They allowed themselves to trust their own judgment. They allowed themselves to believe that their observations were valid. That shift changed everything. Because trust isn't built in a single moment. Trust is built through repeated experiences that slowly remove uncertainty. Your soulmate had experienced enough. They had seen enough. They had learned enough. The foundation of trust was no longer being constructed, it already existed. And as they reflected on that reality, they understood why the emotions had become so overwhelming. It wasn't only because they had discovered your honesty. It was because your honesty had reminded them of something they thought they had lost forever. The ability to believe in people again. Listen carefully, because this is the chapter where everything your soulmate has been feeling finally reaches a point where it can no longer be hidden, and your heart needs this right now. After all the quiet observations, all the unanswered questions, and all the moments that slowly revealed the truth, your soulmate found themselves standing in a place they never expected to reach. For so long, they had relied on caution as a form of protection. They believed that if they questioned everything, expected less, and kept their emotions guarded, they could avoid being hurt. That approach had helped them survive difficult experiences in the past, but it had also created distance between them and the possibility of genuine trust. Then you entered their life, and without even realizing it, you began challenging beliefs they had carried for years. It wasn't because you gave speeches about honesty. It wasn't because you constantly tried to prove yourself. It happened through something much more powerful. It happened through consistency. Day after day, situation after situation, your actions continued matching your words. Your choices reflected your values even when doing so wasn't convenient. Your behavior remained steady regardless of who was watching. And listen to this: the longer your soulmate observed these things, the more impossible it became to dismiss them. At first, they told themselves they were being objective. They told themselves they were simply gathering information. But deep down, something else was happening. Every honest action from you was slowly rebuilding a belief they thought had disappeared. Every sincere moment was helping repair a piece of trust that had been damaged by past disappointments. They didn't realize how much healing was taking place until one day they found themselves reflecting on the difference between who they used to be and who they were becoming. Before meeting you, they often expected people to disappoint them. They expected hidden agendas. They expected promises to be broken. They expected honesty to have limits. But now they were facing evidence that contradicted those expectations. And your heart needs this right now because evidence has a way of changing people when they are willing to pay attention. The truth was standing in front of them, and the truth looked very different from what fear had taught them to expect. As these realizations continued growing, your soulmate became increasingly emotional. Not because of any single event, but because of what all those events represented together. They started remembering times when they had silently questioned your intentions. They remembered moments when they had waited for proof that never came. They remembered situations where they expected inconsistency but found integrity instead. Looking back on those moments created a mixture of emotions. There was relief. There was gratitude. There was admiration. There was even a little guilt. Not because they had done anything wrong, but because they realized how often fear had made them doubt something genuine. And listen to this, self-awareness can be overwhelming. The moment people recognize how much their fears have influenced their decisions, they often see things differently. Your soulmate was beginning to understand that many of the doubts they carried had never truly been about you. They were about old experiences, old wounds, old disappointments. You simply became the person who unknowingly challenged those fears. The more they thought about it, the more emotional they became. They realized that your honesty had been teaching them lessons without ever trying to. It had taught them that trust is not built through perfection. It is built through consistency. It had taught them that genuine character reveals itself in ordinary moments, not just dramatic situations. It had taught them that authenticity is often quiet. It does not demand attention. It simply remains true to itself over time. And your heart needs this right now because those lessons were changing your soulmate from the inside out. They found themselves becoming more open, more hopeful, more willing to believe in possibilities they once avoided. For years, they had convinced themselves that expecting less was safer than hoping for more. Yet your presence kept proving otherwise. It kept reminding them that caution and wisdom are not the same thing. It kept reminding them that protecting your heart should not require closing it completely. One evening, while reflecting on everything they had learned, your soulmate experienced a moment of clarity unlike anything they had felt before. They thought about every observation, every conversation, every situation that revealed your honesty. They thought about how many opportunities you had to choose easier paths and how often you chose integrity instead. They thought about how consistently your actions reflected your values. And listen to this, as those thoughts came together, they felt something break inside them. Not in a painful way. In a healing way. The final pieces of fear they had been carrying for years suddenly felt unnecessary. The defensive walls they had relied on began crumbling. The skepticism that once felt protective began losing its purpose. Because for the first time in a very long time, they no longer felt like they needed those defenses. The realization hit them harder than they expected. Tears filled their eyes before they fully understood why. These tears were different from the ones they had cried during painful chapters of their life. Those tears came from heartbreak, disappointment, and loss. These tears came from relief. Relief that genuine honesty still existed. Relief that their faith in people had not been completely misplaced. Relief that they had finally encountered someone whose character remained steady regardless of circumstances. And your heart needs this right now because relief can be just as emotional as pain. Sometimes the release of fear creates emotions powerful enough to overwhelm even the strongest people. Your soulmate sat quietly with those feelings. They allowed themselves to experience them instead of hiding from them. They allowed themselves to acknowledge how much your honesty had affected them. They allowed themselves to admit that you had become important to them in ways they never expected. As the tears continued, they thought about everything your honesty represented. It wasn't only about trust. It was about hope. It was about believing that meaningful connections are still possible. It was about believing that authenticity still matters. It was about believing that some people remain true to their values even when life makes that difficult. Those realizations touched parts of their heart they hadn't visited in years. Parts that had been hidden behind disappointment. Parts that had been buried beneath caution. Parts that had quietly stopped expecting good surprises. And listen to this, your honesty awakened those parts again. It reminded them that vulnerability is not weakness. It reminded them that trust can be earned. It reminded them that hope is not foolish when it is supported by evidence. By the end of that emotional moment, your soulmate felt different. Not because their entire life had changed overnight, but because their perspective had. They no longer saw trust as something dangerous. They saw it as something valuable when placed in the right hands. They no longer viewed honesty as something rare and temporary. They saw it as something that still exists in people who choose to live by their values. Most importantly, they no longer viewed their feelings toward you through the lens of fear. They viewed them through the lens of reality. And reality had shown them someone whose honesty had remained consistent through every observation, every challenge, and every test they never admitted to conducting. That realization stayed with them long after the tears stopped. It followed them into future conversations. It followed them into quiet moments of reflection. It followed them into dreams about what the future might hold. Because once they accepted the truth about your character, they could no longer return to the uncertainty they once felt. Something had changed permanently. Something had healed. Something had been restored. And as they looked toward the future, carrying both gratitude and admiration in their heart, they understood one final truth. The reason they broke down in tears was never because they discovered something shocking about you. It was because they discovered something beautiful, proof that honesty, integrity, and authenticity are still real, and proof that someone like you had quietly reminded them how to believe in those things again.